Alright everyone, welcome to another exciting episode of Build Guide. So before I begin this video, I want to go on one final tangent about the first battle circuit. Since many people have asked, I just want to set the record straight and point out that I did eventually shave my score on that one to just barely under 20 minutes before it expired. But anyway, this video is about the second battle circuit, the Advanced Physical Battle Circuit. So when I first saw this, I was pretty freaked out about it. But ultimately, it was way less of a nightmare than the first one was. But it was also the direct result of how bad the first one was. So they made a bunch of changes this time. And the first big change for this battle circuit is that, well, for me anyway, I was actually able to beat it in the two parts it came out in. See, it still took me about 3 days to complete it. But because they were easier, I was able to beat them as they came out. And since I beat them broken up, I didn't go super crazy about it this time. So that being said, since I did it in two parts, I have to divide this video into two parts. And in retrospect, maybe I should have just made two videos, but I didn't know how this was going to play out ahead of time, so you're going to just have to bear with me. Now, that being said, I got through this one way faster than the first one. And I had to do way less farming to max out my parts. And I still had to max out a ton of money because there were parts where I had to make some new red parts to get by. But I still have a good supply of Haros left over now that's over. So it wasn't a shit show disaster like the first one. Now in general, the hardest missions on this battle circuit seem to be the first few missions. Mission 10, 15, and the last mission. Now, the first 10 rounds, I had a really hard time getting started. As you might recall, physical attacks have always tripped me up, and they led to me having one of my worst showings back in the old Inferno missions. Now, at first I thought I could just modify some of my older builds to make them work for this circuit too. As it turns out, I did get that to work by the end of the circuit, but to start out with, that wasn't viable. So the first 10 rounds I played a little bit more open-ended, and it was a much harder venture than I was prepared for. So the first couple of rounds, I got my ass handed to me over and over again. And I kinda got stuck because I couldn't think of good low-level builds to get my foot in the door. Since I had no other good strategies, I turned to Smiley T1's build guide again, because he was already ahead of the curve and had once again figured out the bare minimum builds for this battle circuit already. So, round 1. I originally used Smiley's build again here. And the build here was like a Gan puncher with pretty solid melee attacks. Now, it uses the Gan head to offset its pathetically low melee stats. And this was a Smiley suit, so I'm just gonna give all the suits in this video dumb nicknames this time. So let's name this one Punchy Gan. On the replay, I pumped it up pretty severely using the unicorn parts, so that way it had good melee. But otherwise, I never found a good use for the parts in any other rounds, and this build Smiley put together was a little tricky for me to use. So, round 2. Round 2 I also used the Smiley build, and this was another really annoying one. So, Smiley put together a suit that relies on, number 1, clearing the stage without taking any damage, and then killing the Barbatos at the end by using self-destruct. What a show-off. Now the problem being is if you use self-destruct and you don't have full health, even if you kill the boss, well, it's a loss. So I know that a lot of people use self-destruct in the first battle circuit as well, and while it's a strategy, it's really obnoxious and it's really difficult to pull off. So otherwise, this build is a decent physical fighter using a big wrench. Nickname on this one, Suicidal Drama Queen. So at round 3, I started to slowly drift away from Smiley's framework, although this one here is still based on one of his research strategies. So for my version, I popped on some additional parts from the Mobile Sumo to give it a much better defense stat, And then Smiley figured out a really good strategy here where you pop combat stance twice and then combine it with the Psycho Jammer to induce stun, thereby allowing you to get a completely unblockable execution. As always, Smiley came up with another genius strategy to get through these things. Anyway, I guess the nickname for this one is the Stun Killer. Now, in round 4, Smiley put together a completely decent shooter build using a bunch of junk parts and the archer stance from the serpent arms. Now, my junk parts weren't 100% the same as his, so I had to tweak this build a little bit, and for whatever reason, my version also managed to get the commander tag to pop off. Nickname here, Garbage Shooter. Now, round 5 was the first round where I got tripped up a bit by the challenge of it all. So, in this round, you have to build a Gundam type MS. Smiley put together this really nice super robot for his run, and I tried to do kind of the same using the Tryon 3 legs, but I ran into difficulty because my other parts weren't the same as his. But I actually kind of love the build I put together. So for my version, I got the melee to work out, and you need to have a melee of over 11,000 here. Now, somehow Smiley got that to work on his build, probably by using different parts I didn't have, like he used a Justice backpack and a Veil sword, but I put together a different build using more general parts, and instead I built a more balanced build, and that gave me some decently average stat parts. And yeah, just anytime you use the Tryon 3 parts, it makes your build pretty fun. My nickname on this build was the Super Robot Muteki Gundam. So, round 6, the first bad switch mode level. Now, I followed Smiley's guide very loosely here and took his idea to use the Santa Capsule head, but otherwise I went my own way and I built kind of a general attacker. Now, Smiley's version used a lot of parts I didn't have again, or he had maxed out some things too casually for my own liking. I jazzed it out and I found some other parts that worked really well, and as far as I can tell, as long as you can get your melee defense in this one over 11,000 and pair it with some decent EX skills, you'll be able to get by this one. Nickname, I can't believe it's not the Santa Capsule. Now, round 7 turned out to be the round where Smiley's guide started to full-on fall apart for me. Now, I took the following ideas from Smiley. Used the Artemis Gundam, used parts from the Astray Red, and used Tobia Ironox as the pilot to get Pro Tag to pop. And that's about it. After that, I started doing my own build from here. Now, I put together a super ruthless version of this build by equipping Bisect and Transam. This ended up being kind of a mashup between the Retro Exia build I had last circuit and the Gundam Artemis. So the nickname here is the Retro X Artemis. Now, round 8, from Smiley, I took the idea of making a mobile fighter type mobile suit. And I also got high power to work by using the Albator's backpack. But on my own, I decided to give it a Master Gundam / Noble Gundam theme. And since I had Mobile Fighter popped, that just generally gave me some stronger parts to use. So I was able to get this thing to really flourish in combat. Nickname here, Master of Girls. Round 9 was the round where I just full-on gave up on Smiley's build guide. And I don't know if it was because I was feeling unhappy with it, or if I was more feeling confident in my own abilities because I've been having a really fast string of wins in a very short amount of time. So this time I put together something completely severe. Since Overdrive mode made everything extremely hard, I put together the finest build I could come up with without using any of my extra decent parts. This time around, I put together something I'm calling the Rage Exia Gundam. And then I arrived at round 10, exhausted and bitter at the end of the first week of the second battle circuit. Now, since I'd already stopped following Smiley at this point, I put together a remake of my Epion Unicorn Kit Bash from the first battle circuit, which I'm now going to nickname the Epicorn. Also, I used the Altered Domon, which I got in one of the recent events, and that ended up letting the melee attack on this thing go completely balls out crazy bonkers. So round 10 was really hard, but with this crazy overpowered build, I managed to handle it. And that's how I finished the first week of the battle circuit. And then I felt pretty good about myself. For a while. So, some time passed, and then after a couple of days, the remaining second half of the Advanced Physical Battle Circuit popped up. And in the lull in between that week and this week, I did some pretty hard thinking. So, in the first battle circuit earlier in the month, I was very, very hella reliant on Smiley's battle guide for Gunpla. And thankfully, I happen to also run a YouTube channel, which gives me the super special advantage of the fact that I can look back at what I did in the first battle circuit and criticize myself. This is a huge advantage because I can look over my previous builds, I can verify what they were, and I can verify how they did. So I took a few seconds and I decided to look at how overly or unoverly dependent I was on Smiley in the first battle circuit. And when I really crunched the data, yeah, so it looks like I only made an original suit about 4 times in the first battle circuit, and all the other rounds I either flat out copied Smiley, or I modified something he figured out, or I tried my best to make kind of a substitute for something he had come up with strategy-wise. And again, Smiley's a really good guy. I love Smiley, I like what he's done, but if I'm being honest, he uses a lot of parts I just don't have, and his gameplay style is not always the way I like to conduct things. So, I get that he's trying to build these builds to the bare minimums, but right now, I was feeling that I wanted to build a ton of shooter units and shoot everything I could find. So ultimately this was the point where I decided to go my own way. So now we go to part 2 of the battle circuit. And I was feeling so confident in myself at this point, and based on everything that had happened up to this point, I decided to not use any of Smiley's builds, and to give myself a challenge, I decided that I would finish it on my own. So, here we go. Going into the last 10 laps, I knew I needed to give myself something of a handicap, or otherwise I'd be screwed out of having the parts I needed when I needed them. Now, despite that, in a couple of instances, I went all out crazy, and I beat a couple of stages by building overpowered full-power mobile suits. Now, the only stages I had to majorly redo a bunch of times were 13 and 15, because those were exceptionally hard, and I had to rework my builds to clear them again with weaker parts. Because rather the parts I initially used in 13 and 15, I had to unpair from those stages, because I ended up needing them for my ultimate build in round 20. So, here goes nothing. In round 11 was to build a 4-space unit. So I ended up building my first rapid shooter build using a lot of really cool parts. I used the new Gundam head, the Reborn's chest, all for their shooting stats, the arms from the Zeta, the lightened backpack for their EX skills, and I might have overdone it when I paired it all with the Unicorn Bazooka, but all in all, this is probably how I got my time so low. So, nickname here, Space Heavy Zeta. Round 12. Now, round 12 was the first really bad skill hack mode for the second part, and I decided to keep using shooters. Now, this is where I pulled out my Altered Tall Geese 3 head to use Altered Archer Stance, and by pairing that with the new Gundam Red backpack, as it occurred to me that I was never going to get the funnels off as this circuit plays out, I overwrote them to give me another offense upskill. And then I also used the Gundam XX chest here, but I never touched the AX skill on it. That was garbage, it just never happened. So otherwise, this thing just turned out to be an incredibly strong shooter. I nicknamed this thing the Gunpla. My first play of round 13, I actually just straight up built the Tarantazzi. But that ended up being really bad because the Tarantazzi arms ended up being utterly vital towards my strategy in round 20. So I ended up redoing the build here a bunch of times and mixed things up a lot. I popped in the Versago arms for their base stats, and I popped in the Camphor legs to make up for the loss in firepower from not using the Tauzi parts. Also, you're going to see here that I used the full armor unicorn's backpack, but because the EX skill on that backpack is so unfortunately painfully slow, and you can be killed while you're using that skill, I didn't use it, and I instead just used a Jagan shield for my final EX skill, because that had great guaranteeable splash damage. Nickname on this thing, Guns, Guns, and More Guns. Now, round 14 was one of the last serious melee builds I put together. The Avalanche Exia parts I got this week came super in handy to put this one together, and I accented them with some of the other parts from my main Exia melee build, and the Sinanju legs. Now, amusingly, despite beam melee attacks being nerfed in this mode, since I managed to get the melee on this thing above 20,000, they were still usable, which was a total relief for me in this one. Nickname here, War Exia Gundam. Now, round 15 was a little bit of a disaster. In my opinion, round 15 was the hardest stage for my initial run of this. To clear round 15, I needed to put together a shooter build, and since it's skill hack, reverse style, you need to put together a minimum shot defense of at least 19,000, which I later pumped even higher so I could have a better score. Now, I ended up being really super dependent on the Kshatriya's arms to get me to that stat. I also used all the serious parts from the high new I had, and I ended up using my Altered Zeta backpack upon realizing that I didn't need it for round 20 because it only works on beam parts. So it only ended up being useful to give me good stats for a bad EX skill part. Now, the EX skills I ended up using were the back Gatling from the GM Cardigan, which was okay, but a little bit tricky to use, and the Photon Bomb from the Mac Knife, which was just the same as bad. Lastly, because I was running out of EX skills at this point, I managed to make the 120mm gun from the gun tank work, and that was crazy, but that was such a pain in the ass to pull off. Now, eventually I finally got this build to work, but I know I could push this thing a little bit farther if I could just have a better mark for the Kshatriya. Anyway, the nickname on this one was the New Age Space Gun Tank. Now, round 16 was the last time I used melee. And this time I had to pull out all the stops. So I used the Unicorn arms, the Quanta legs, the Epion head, and I put together a really nice unit that utilized assassination, anchor shot, and halberd throw, all to their optimal best. But this is a really tricky stage, and when I replayed this, I had a hard time memorizing which EX skills worked best on killing which bosses. Now, I again also managed to get my melee stat here over 20,000, which is also critical to making this build work, as well as popping off pro tag and close combat to send the stats even higher. Nickname on this one, Black Epion. Now, for round 17 I built another really fun physical rapid shooter. But I started to get into a bad rut here where I was running out of extremely good shooter parts. Now, I had to get a little bit more creative this time around to make things work properly. So this time around I used the Extreme Gundam legs and the other GM Cardigan backpack. And also I upgraded Banagher here to a red part so I could swap out his skill with the one from Lila Mira Lila, which makes physical shots hit harder. That skill was totally vital to me being able to clear the stage with this build, since if I did not have that skill, the shot attack would otherwise be too low. Nickname here, Powered Up Double Zeta. Now round 18 was the last melee build I put together, but actually this melee build is kind of like a melee shooter all-rounder build. Now quite frankly, I'm not intensely happy with what I put together here, because I definitely used up all my best melee parts in round 14, so when I hit round 18, I was kind of running into a disadvantage. Now this suit is kind of a representative of like all the scraps I had laying around at the time, and I did my absolute best to clear the stage using this thing, but it actually weirdly works as a mixed attacker, because the Magella top cannon lets it survive most fights until its melee EX skills can kick in for kills. Now, my biggest regret on this build is since all my red parts got used up in the other stages, it has no real special abilities, so to speak of. So the nickname for this one is the Starving Barbatos. Now, in round 19, I utilized all the remaining parts I knew I had that I wasn't going to use on round 20, and built a half-decent Gundam based around the spare wing parts I had left over, the Banshee Norn's arms, and a few more pieces of the heavy arms that I was saving. And then just whatever I had left that worked. Now, this was a weird battle circuit since it was the first time I did the whole thing myself, and I totally fell into a pitfall of wasting all my good parts early on. Now, despite that, this build worked out really decently thanks to the heavy arms chest, and ironically the Girazula's grenade launcher, which I patched onto the altered Exia shield. Nickname here, Heavy Wing Gun. And finally, we at last came to round 20. And once again, round 20 is the hardest stage the game has ever come up with. And unfortunately this time around, I was quite legitimately screwed. So although I had managed to breeze through most of the circuit in about a day, this was the part where I got stopped and run into a wall. Now, I originally had wanted to just full-on rebuild the full armor Unicorn Zeta kit bash I had rocked in the first battle circuit round 20, but it seemed like that was not going to cut the mustard this time around, especially it seemed that the previous build I had used was very dependent on the Crossbones beam gun and the Unicorn's beam arms, which unfortunately were both completely useless this time around. So I ended up having to go back to the drawing board, and I had to replay several earlier rounds to put together what, in my opinion, was the absolute best possible rapid shooter build I could build in the game to beat this final round. And despite that, the hand weapon still ended up being a little bit subpar, and that was definitely something of a detriment to me. But I used literally every Wing Zero's part I could get my hand on, and that gave me incredibly high stats. Now, just so you know, my current build is rocking a shooter stat of over 27,000, but the first time I beat the stage, it was only 21. Now, I didn't have a good time on it until I got above 23 though. Now, the nickname here is Gundam X-Wing, and the build I put together here is so heavily dependent on the fact that the altered full-armored Unicorn Gundams boost the effect of the arm weapon, which in this case is the Tarantauzi's smoothbore gun. And so as a result of that, I would use the other two weapons first and save the smoothbore gun to shoot the Barbatos in the head at the final part of the stage. Now, speaking of the final part of the stage, it's typically the same as any other stage and not any more or less difficult. But the reason I played this stage so many times, and what fucking sucks about it, is that when the Terran, the Barbatos, and the Guzan all spawn at the same time, they usually corner you, and you're going to be completely killed if you don't target them in the right order. And that sucks, because the targeting in this game is completely wonky. So what you need to do is you need to kill the Barbatos immediately since it's rushing at you. And if you succeed in doing that, then the Guzan needs to die next because it's slowly going to kill you. Then finally the Talzi is honestly not a threat at all once it's by itself. All you have to do is run around it and do a dance with it, and it's dead, and then the stage ends. And that, my friends, is the end of the Advanced Physical Battle Circuit. I cleared it by myself. Well, Smiley helped in the first 7 rounds, but I cleared it mostly by myself. And anyway, I'm feeling so much better about this one than I did with the first one. Now, I'm assuming next time, based on where we can go from here, I have a feeling the next event will be a shooter event. So I'm very glad that I preemptively built up all my shooter builds and semi-fleshed those out during this one. Now, this battle circuit was so much easier than the first one, and now I have almost the entire Valkyrie Gundam. I still need the arms, but I can put it together, and once you give it a decent coat of paint, it looks pretty freaking metal. Anyway, thank you guys for sticking around for my second Battle Circuit Deep Dive video. I really enjoy doing these videos because this is honestly where all of the game's most interesting content is ending up nowadays. And I have a feeling that the next Battle Circuit will be even easier because now I'm getting into the rhythm of doing them. But anyway guys, please subscribe to my channel. I need 550 more subscribers to get remonetized. I really need you guys to help me out. I just lost my job due to the virus, and I'm now surviving on food rations that come with letters from a person pretending to be Donald Trump, but they're written in Spanish. And also, I'm just going to announce it now that if I can get 1,000 subscribers, I will do a full long play live stream of New Gundam Breaker, which everyone tells me is awful, and I'm sure I'm gonna hate it. But I'll do that for you if I get my channel remonetized. That's the prize. Okay, thank you people. I was me, Buster Green. I am still alive. Good night.